They said, "You won't understand the meeting, just sign the papers." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and slow to fade, and I felt my throat tighten as though the sentence itself had been a fist. My son's voice had been even, almost casual, as if he were brushing crumbs from a table. But to me, it sounded like a verdict. I had always thought that the years I had poured into this family, into raising him, into holding the edges of our lives together through nights of sickness, of bills unpaid, of meals stretched thin, would have counted for something. Yet in that moment, he looked at me not as the woman who carried him, but as a burden to be managed, a signature to be collected. I stared at the manila folder on the table. Its corners were sharp, too precise, the kind that left little cuts if your skin grazed them. My name, written in thick black ink across the top, mocked me. I wasn't supposed to open it. I was supposed to obey. I nodded then, but my hand hovered, fingers brushing the edge without commitment. My silence seemed to please them. My son leaned back in his chair, already reaching for his phone, his wife beside him pouring herself another glass of water. The message was clear, the matter was settled. But it wasn't. Not for me. The room was too quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I heard it louder than I had ever heard it before, each second a reminder that time was moving, dragging me deeper into a place where I was no longer trusted, no longer needed. I remembered when my opinion was the first thing my children sought, when they would sit at the kitchen table and ask, "What should we do, Mom?" I remembered the weight of their faith in me. And now, here I was, told I wouldn't understand. It is a strange thing, to feel erased while your body is still alive and breathing. I excused myself under the pretense of making tea. The kettle gave me a reason to stand, to walk away from their casual betrayal. In the kitchen, I steadied myself against the counter, my hand trembling slightly. I could hear their muffled voices from the dining room, discussing something with the ease of people who had already made their decisions. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The exclusion was already complete. As the water boiled, I stared at the steam curling upward, twisting like thoughts I couldn't hold down. I told myself not to cry. Crying had become my instinctive language in recent years, though I hated it. It made me feel small, childish, but the tears arrived regardless, quiet, uninvited guests. I wiped them away quickly, forcing my face back into composure before I returned to the table with the teapot. "Sign here," my son said when I sat down. He slid the folder toward me as though it were nothing more than a receipt at a grocery store. His wife smiled thinly, as though trying to soften the bluntness of his words. I wanted to ask, what exactly am I signing? But the weight of their impatience pressed down on me. They were waiting. They wanted me to be quick, cooperative, invisible. Instead of reaching for the pen, I folded my hands in my lap. "I'll read it first," I said softly. There was a pause. My son looked up, his eyebrows lifting with surprise that quickly shifted to annoyance. "Mom, you won't understand it. It's legal stuff. Technical. That's why we're here, to help you." His words were meant to soothe, but I heard them for what they were, a dismissal dressed in false concern. I felt my lips tighten, but I said nothing. I opened the folder. The papers were dense with text, paragraphs layered in small, neat print. My eyes blurred at first, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of words. But I pressed on, tracing each line with my finger, reading slowly, deliberately. And then, out loud. The room shifted as my voice filled it. At first shaky, then steadier, I read every clause, every condition. My son shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his wife sipped her water with exaggerated patience. I ignored them both. Each word I spoke aloud seemed to stitch something back into me, a reminder that I was not invisible, not voiceless. The papers belonged to me. My name was on them. My signature would bind me. That alone gave me the right to every single word. The silence between my sentences was thick. I could feel the impatience pressing in from both sides of the table, but I refused to let it move me. Page by page, I read. And with every paragraph, a memory surfaced. Not of the papers themselves, but of the years that had led me here. Of signing school permission slips late at night after long shifts at the factory. Of signing mortgage documents when we bought our first home, my hand shaking not from age but from fear that the payments would swallow us. Of signing checks to keep the lights on, to pay for my son's braces, to cover funeral costs when my husband passed too soon. My life had been measured in signatures. And now they wanted one more, quiet, unquestioned, unthinking. But I would not give it that way. "Mom," my son said finally, his voice sharp now. "This isn't necessary. Just trust me." I lifted my eyes from the page and met his. For a long moment, I simply looked at him. The boy who once brought me crayon drawings and begged me to hang them on the fridge was gone, replaced by this man who thought I was incapable of understanding. And yet, I had understood enough to raise him, to keep him alive when he could not even tie his own shoes. I turned back to the papers. My voice trembled, but I kept reading. I don't know how long I sat there, refusing to be hurried, but when I finally placed the last page back into the folder, my tea had gone cold. My son's jaw was tight, his wife's smile had disappeared altogether. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of defiance, small but steady, like a candle flame refusing to be snuffed out. That night, after they left, I sat in the quiet of my living room. The folder remained on the table, unopened again, but heavy with meaning. I thought about the way they had looked at me, not unkind, but patronizing, as if I were a child in need of guidance. It wasn't malice. It was worse, dismissal. The house was too silent. Every tick of the clock echoed. I thought of calling someone, a friend, perhaps, but I realized with a hollow sort of clarity that I had let most friendships slip away over the years. My world had shrunk to the walls of this house, to the orbit of my children's visits. And in that shrinking, I had lost pieces of myself without even noticing. But tonight, I noticed. Tonight, I felt the loss as sharply as the cut of paper on skin. And with that sting came a quiet resolve, I would not be erased so easily. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house as it settled into the cold hours. Every sound became amplified, the whir of the refrigerator, the faint hum of a car passing outside, the hollow echo of my own breath. I tried closing my eyes, tried shifting from side to side, but each time I did, the same sentence came back like an echo I couldn't quiet: "You won't understand. Just sign the papers." It was not only the words that hurt but the certainty with which they were delivered. As though my understanding was no longer required. As though my role in the family had shrunk to that of a pen. A hand to scrawl a name. Nothing more. By dawn, my eyes burned, but my mind was clear. I rose quietly, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me. The morning light streamed weakly through the curtains, casting long shadows across the table. I ran my hand over the cover of the folder. The ink of my name seemed bolder in daylight, an accusation I couldn't ignore. I opened it again. Slowly. Carefully. This time, I didn't read aloud. I read silently, mouthing the words, stopping often to piece together their meaning. There were clauses about property, about accounts, about decisions to be made in case of illness or death. My death. My decline. It startled me how easily they had spoken of it last night, as if planning for the inevitable meant it no longer hurt to imagine it. But for me, each line pressed against a raw nerve. I traced one paragraph with my finger, pausing to take it in. It spoke of transferring authority, of power of attorney, and I understood enough to realize that what they wanted was not just a signature. They wanted control. I closed the folder and sat back in my chair. My chest felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. For a long moment, I simply stared at the steam rising from my tea. Then I said, quietly, into the empty kitchen, "No." The word surprised me. It sounded strange in the quiet, firm in a way my voice hadn't been in years. I carried that no with me throughout the day. When my neighbor Mrs. Ellis waved from across the street, I surprised myself by walking over instead of just waving back from my porch. She was pulling weeds from the edge of her garden, her knees sunk into the soil, her hands dirty and alive. "Haven't seen you out much," she said, brushing dirt from her palms. I smiled faintly. "I've been tired." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Well, come by for coffee sometime. Doesn't do a person good to stay in too much." I promised I would, and I meant it. Back inside, I felt a strange restlessness. The house, once a comfort, felt like a box closing in. I walked from room to room, touching objects as though they might remind me of who I had been. The worn armchair where my husband used to sit with his newspaper. The bookshelf that still held the cookbooks I rarely opened now. The small framed photos of birthdays and graduations, my children smiling, my arms always around them. I wondered when I had become more picture than person to them. That evening, the phone rang. It was my son. "Did you finish reading?" he asked, his voice clipped, businesslike. "I did," I replied. "And?" I hesitated. "And I need more time." There was silence on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Mom, this isn't complicated. You're overthinking it." "Perhaps," I said. "But it's my signature. My life. I'll think as much as I please." His sigh grew heavier. "We're just trying to make things easier for you." I felt my throat tighten, but my voice stayed steady. "No. You're trying to make things easier for yourselves." The silence that followed was thick, but I didn't back away from it. For once, I let it stand. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Just quiet. Like a room that had been opened to fresh air. Over the next few days, I carried myself differently. It wasn't a dramatic change, no one looking from the outside would have noticed. But inside, I felt something small unfurling, like a seed cracking open. I began writing things down. Thoughts. Fragments of memory. Little observations about the day. I hadn't kept a journal in years, but now each word I put on paper felt like a reclaiming of voice. Some nights I wrote about the folder, about my son's tone, about the way my daughter-in-law's smile had faltered. Other nights I wrote about smaller things, the smell of rain on the sidewalk, the way the neighbor's cat always lounged on my fence, the ache in my knees when I climbed the stairs. Ordinary things, but they belonged to me. I realized how long it had been since I had done something just for myself. One afternoon, I walked to the library. It had been years since I'd been inside, but the smell of books was the same, warm, dusty, alive with memory. I checked out a thick, difficult novel, the kind I might once have been intimidated by, and carried it home in my bag like a secret. That night, as I turned the pages slowly, stumbling over words I had to look up, I felt a quiet thrill. If I could wrestle with this book, I could wrestle with those papers. Days passed. My son called again, more insistent this time. "Mom, we need to get this settled. You're dragging it out." I thought of the seed inside me, the tiny stubborn flame that had begun to grow. "I'll sign nothing until I'm ready," I told him. His frustration was sharp. "Why are you making this so difficult? We're family. We're trying to protect you." I paused, then said softly, "If protecting me means silencing me, then it isn't protection." He didn't reply. After we hung up, I stood at the window, watching the evening settle over the street. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of sky that demanded you look at it, even if only for a moment. I thought of all the evenings I had missed, too busy folding laundry, cooking dinner, signing school slips. And now, finally, here I was, seeing it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was mine. I had always thought defiance would feel loud. That standing up for yourself would come with fire, with a shout, with some dramatic gesture that people couldn't ignore. But when it finally came for me, it wasn't a roar. It was a whisper. It was the word no, spoken in a kitchen to an empty house, and the decision not to pick up a pen when they told me to. And yet, that whisper had started to echo. The following week, my son and his wife came by again. They didn't call first. They knocked firmly on the door, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission but announces arrival. I opened it slowly, already bracing myself. "Mom," my son said, smiling too wide, as though rehearsed. "We thought we'd stop by. Talk things through." I stepped aside, letting them in. The house, my house, suddenly felt smaller with them inside it, their presence filling the space like a storm cloud. His wife carried a tote bag, from which she pulled the folder almost immediately, placing it back on the table like a challenge. I made tea, deliberately slow. I listened to the clink of the cups, the whistle of the kettle, grounding myself in the small tasks that still belonged to me. When I returned to the table, they were already seated, the folder open between them. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be," my son began. "We just want to take the stress off you." I sat across from him. My hands curled around the warmth of the teacup. "And what do I get in return for giving up my say?" He blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. His wife leaned forward, her tone soothing. "Peace of mind. You won't have to worry about these complicated matters anymore." "I don't mind worrying," I said. My voice was calm, but it felt like a stone placed firmly on the ground. My son sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Mom, why are you being so stubborn?" "Because I've been quiet for too long," I wanted to say. "Because the woman you see sitting in front of you, the one you think doesn't understand, is the same woman who once held your hand through fevers, who sat awake worrying about how to feed you, who signed every paper life threw at us when no one else was there to do it." Instead, I took a breath and said, "I'm not stubborn. I'm careful." The silence that followed was heavy. His wife broke it with a forced laugh. "Well, maybe you could have a lawyer look it over if you don't feel confident." I smiled faintly. "That's exactly what I planned to do." Their surprise was almost comical, though I didn't laugh. My son leaned back, frowning. "A lawyer? Mom, that's unnecessary. It'll just cost money you don't need to spend." "It's my money," I said simply. For the first time in years, I saw my son speechless. It should have pained me, seeing him unsettled by my defiance, but instead I felt a quiet ripple of strength move through me. Like a tree rediscovering its roots. After they left, I sat at the table a long time, staring at the folder. My heart was still racing, but underneath the nerves was something else, relief. I had said it aloud. I had made it clear that I would not be dismissed. That night, I took out my journal and wrote more than I had in weeks. I wrote about the visit, about the look on his face, about the small thrill of standing my ground. And then I wrote about the past, the woman I used to be, the one who could argue with a bank manager about overdraft fees, who could confront a teacher when her child was treated unfairly. That woman had not disappeared entirely. She had only been sleeping. The next morning, I called a lawyer. The voice on the other end was brisk, efficient, but not unkind. I explained that I had some papers I wanted reviewed. We set an appointment for later in the week. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet, listening to my own breathing. I realized how strange it felt to take action after so long of simply reacting. For years, I had let life wash over me, letting others make decisions, convincing myself it was easier that way. But now, I was moving again. The day of the appointment, I put on a blouse I hadn't worn in years. I even dabbed on a bit of perfume, the bottle dusty from disuse. As I walked to the bus stop, the air felt different, crisp, alive, as though the world itself was acknowledging my steps. The lawyer was young, younger than my son, but professional. He spread the papers out on his desk, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. I sat across from him, hands folded, waiting. "These are significant documents," he said finally. "They would give your son complete authority over your financial and medical decisions." I nodded slowly. I thought so. He glanced at me. Did you want that? I held his gaze. No. He smiled faintly. Then you shouldn't sign them. The clarity of it was almost laughable. So simple. So obvious. And yet, how easily I had been convinced that my confusion was inevitable, that I didn't have the right to question. As I left the office, papers tucked back into my bag, I felt taller somehow. Not in height, but in presence. That evening, I called my son. My voice was steady as I said, I won't be signing those papers. There was a long pause. Then his voice, sharp with frustration, you don't know what you're doing. Yes, I replied quietly. I do. And I hung up. For the rest of the night, I sat in my armchair with the lights off, watching the streetlights glow outside. My heart ached with a strange mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness that my son saw me as less than capable. Pride that I had proven, at least to myself, that I was not. In the stillness, I realized something else. This was not just about papers. It was about the slow erosion of a life. The way a person becomes background noise in their own family, their presence taken for granted, their voice ignored. And I knew then that I wasn't done fighting. Not just for my right to say no, but for my right to still be someone. I had thought that saying no would be the hardest part. That once I had spoken the word aloud, once I had held the line against my son's insistence, the rest would come easier. But I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't saying no. The hardest part was living with what followed, the silence, the distance, the quiet, bruising disappointment that radiated from him in every clipped phone call, every shortened visit. It is a peculiar kind of grief, realizing that your child resents you for protecting yourself. The next time he came to the house, he didn't even sit down. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes narrowed. If you won't sign, he said, then you're on your own when things get complicated. I wanted to tell him that things had always been complicated, that I had navigated complications before he ever knew the meaning of the word. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I only nodded. He left without finishing his tea. For days after, the house felt heavier. Not just quiet, but accusatory, as though the walls themselves had absorbed his disappointment. I tried not to let it consume me, but in the evenings when the light faded, I felt the edges of loneliness pressing in. I wrote in my journal more than ever during that time, filling page after page with fragments of thought, with reminders to myself that I was still here, still thinking, still choosing. But life cannot be lived entirely on paper. So I began venturing out more. At first, it was just the corner shop, the library, the short walk to Mrs. Ellis's garden where we drank coffee out of mismatched mugs and talked about everything and nothing. Then it was further, an art class at the community center, a Saturday market where I let myself buy a scarf in a bold shade of red I hadn't worn in decades. The vendor wrapped it around my shoulders with a smile, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of myself not as a burden, but as a woman still alive in the world. Wearing that scarf home, I passed a mirror in a shop window and almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked younger or transformed, but because I looked present. Awake. And yet, every step forward seemed to widen the gulf between my son and me. When I mentioned the art class to him on the phone, there was a long pause before he said, "Well, I suppose if that makes you happy." His tone was the same one I used to use with him when he insisted on wearing mismatched socks to school. Indulgent. Patronizing. I hung up that evening and sat by the window, watching the sky bruise into dusk, and thought, when did I become the child in his eyes? Still, I kept going. One afternoon at the market, I stopped at a stall selling old vinyl records. The man behind the counter had kind eyes, the sort of eyes that notice people. I found myself thumbing through the stacks, even though I no longer had a record player. When he asked if I was looking for anything in particular, I laughed and said, "No. Just remembering." He smiled and said, "That's good enough." I walked away with nothing in my hands but something lighter in my chest. It was around this time that my daughter called. She lived further away, too busy with her own life to visit often. She had always been different from her brother, less controlling, but also less present. "He told me you're being difficult," she said gently. I braced myself. "Difficult how?" "You won't sign the papers." "That's true." She sighed. "Mom, maybe he's just trying to help." "Maybe you should." No, the word was firmer this time, steadier. "I've read them. I've understood them. And I've decided." "That isn't difficult. That's deciding." There was silence, then a small laugh. "You always were stubborn." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Then maybe I've finally remembered how to be." That night, I wrapped myself in the red scarf and sat on the porch. The air was crisp, the stars scattered faintly above. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of companionship, not from the absent voices of my children, but from the world itself. The night didn't ask me to sign anything. It only asked me to breathe. Still, the ache of exclusion remained. There is a pain in realizing that the people you love most would rather control you than listen to you. But there is also a quiet strength in refusing to let that be the end of your story. So I wrote again, longer than ever, until my hand cramped. I wrote about my husband, how he used to look at me as though my thoughts mattered, how we used to debate over bills late into the night, both stubborn, both certain, and yet always reaching resolution. He would not have told me I wouldn't understand. He would have handed me the papers and said, "What do you think?" I missed him terribly. But in the missing, I also found clarity. If he were still here, I thought, I wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. And maybe that was the point. Maybe I had to learn to fight it on my own. By the end of that week, I had made another decision. I would not wait for my children to define my life. I would begin defining it myself, however small the steps might be. The next morning, I signed up for a book club at the library. It felt absurd, almost comical, such a tiny act, a circle of strangers sitting around discussing chapters. But when I attended the first meeting, sitting in a room that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, listening to others argue passionately about a novel, I felt alive. I added my own thoughts, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. When the meeting ended, someone touched my arm and said, "I liked what you said about the ending. You made me think." Those words carried me all the way home. The call came on a Sunday morning, abrupt and sharp, like the crack of glass. My son's voice was clipped, almost angry. "We're coming over," he said. "We need to settle this once and for all." I wanted to ask him not to. I wanted to tell him I wasn't ready for another battle, that I was still learning how to hold my ground without shaking. But something in me, the same part that had read every page out loud, that had walked into the lawyer's office in my old perfume, said, "Let them come." When they arrived, they didn't bother with pleasantries. My son carried the folder like a weapon, his wife trailing behind with her arms crossed. They sat down at the table without waiting for an invitation. "Mom," he began, his tone already exhausted. "This is getting ridiculous. You're putting yourself at risk. You're putting us at risk. What happens when something happens to you and there are no decisions in place? Do you even think about that?" I sat across from him, my hands folded in my lap. The weight of his words pressed against me, but I didn't bend. "I think about it every day," I said quietly. "That's why I won't hand my life over like it's nothing." His face tightened. "You don't understand how complicated this is." There it was again, the old refrain. "You don't understand." But this time, the words didn't pierce me the same way. They made me angry. A steady, clean anger, not wild or reckless, but focused. "I understand enough," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I understand that these papers would strip me of every decision I still have the right to make. I understand that once I sign, my voice is gone. And I understand that you've stopped listening to me long before I ever picked up that pen. The silence that followed was jagged, heavy. My daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, but my son only stared, his jaw tight. "You raised me to be responsible," he said finally, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "You raised me to take care of things. Why won't you let me take care of you?" For a moment, my chest ached with something close to love. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to tell him that I knew his intentions came wrapped in care, however clumsily. But then I remembered the way his voice had cut, the way he had reduced me to a signature, and I held myself steady. "Taking care of me doesn't mean silencing me," I said softly. "If you love me, then you'll listen. If you respect me, then you'll let me decide." His eyes flashed, a storm I had seen before when he was a boy who didn't get his way. But he was not a boy anymore, and I was not the mother who soothed him with distraction. I was the woman sitting across the table, refusing to disappear. "I won't sign," I said. The words sat between us like a stone, unmovable. He pushed back his chair sharply, the legs scraping the floor. "Fine," he said, his voice hard. "But don't come to me when things go wrong." He left without another word. His wife murmured a quick goodbye and followed, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the house. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folder on the table, my hands trembling slightly. My chest felt hollow, heavy with grief. For all my strength, for all my newfound defiance, I could not deny what it cost, the widening gulf between me and my son. I made tea, though I barely drank it. The ritual steadied me, the whistle of the kettle, the steam rising, the slow pour into the cup. Small anchors in a sea that suddenly felt too vast. And yet, beneath the ache, there was something else. A strange steadiness. A clarity that told me, this pain was necessary. That I had not lost my son entirely, only the illusion that pleasing him was the same as being loved. That night, I wrapped myself in the red scarf and stepped outside. The air was cold, crisp, the kind that bit at your skin and reminded you were alive. I tilted my head back, looking at the stars. They seemed impossibly far away, yet still burning, still present, refusing to vanish. For the first time, I thought, maybe I am the same. The next morning, I cleared the dining table of the folder. I placed it on a shelf, out of sight, not as surrender but as declaration. It no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. Instead, I laid out a puzzle I had bought at the market, 1,000 tiny pieces scattered across the wood. As I began fitting them together, I thought of my life in the same way, not as something handed over, but as something pieced back together, one small act at a time. The house has not changed, and yet it feels different now. The same furniture sits in the same rooms, the same clock ticks on the wall, the same kettle whistles in the kitchen. But something in the air has shifted. Where once the silence felt oppressive, pressing down on me with its weight, now it feels like space. Space that belongs to me. It has been weeks since my son last stood in this doorway, folder clutched in his hand, his disappointment sharp enough to slice the air. I have not seen him since. His absence still aches, there is no point in pretending otherwise. A mother never stops being a mother, no matter how old the child, no matter how strained the bond. But I have stopped waiting for him to call. I no longer pace the rooms with an ear turned to the phone. I no longer measure my days by whether they arrive, whether their visits fill or empty me. I measure them by smaller things now. On Thursdays, I go to the library for the book club. At first, I sat quietly, my voice hesitant, my thoughts guarded. But little by little, I began to add my words to the circle. A sentence here, a small observation there. Last week, after a lively debate about the ending of a novel, a woman touched my arm as we stood to leave and said, "I liked what you said. You made me think." I walked home with those words echoing inside me, like a gift tucked into my coat pocket. The evenings, once unbearable in their quiet, are filled with music again. I bought a record player from a market stall, old and scratched, but faithful. I stacked the vinyls beside it, songs from years long gone, and let the needle drop. The crackle before the music begins feels almost holy, a pause that reminds me I am alive. Sometimes I hum along, sometimes I sway in my chair, sometimes I simply listen, letting the sound seep into the walls, into me. The house no longer feels hollow. It vibrates with memory and presence. In the garden, I planted herbs. A small act, but meaningful. Parsley, basil, thyme, mint. I kneel in the soil in the mornings, fingers brushing the leaves, the scent clinging to my skin. There is comfort in watching them grow, in seeing life insist on itself. When I cook now, I sprinkle fresh leaves into the pan, and the fragrance rises, earthy and sharp, reminding me that I am capable of cultivating, of nourishing. And yet, even with these small joys, there are evenings when grief settles beside me like an old companion. I see my son as a boy, running across the yard with grass-stained knees, clutching dandelions as though they were roses. I hear his laughter, high and unburdened, echoing in the recesses of memory. And then I remember the man he is now, the way his voice hardened across the table when he told me I would not understand. The ache of that contrast is sharp. But I no longer let it undo me. Because I have begun to understand something else, love does not mean surrender. Care does not mean control. Respect does not mean silence. My worth has never depended on whether someone else believes I am capable. One evening, Mrs. Ellis knocked on my door with a basket of muffins. We sat on the porch together, sipping tea as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. She asked me, "How are you?" And I surprised myself by answering honestly. "I'm learning," I said. She nodded as though she knew exactly what I meant. Perhaps she did. After she left, I stood at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. In the glass, my reflection looked back at me, not younger, not transformed, but steady. Present. A woman who had chosen to live her life, not handed over in silence. That night, I pulled the folder from the shelf. I set it on the table, not to read, not to sign, but simply to look. It no longer frightened me. It no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. It was paper, nothing more. Words printed on sheets, powerless without me. I whispered into the quiet, "I will decide." And I realized I wasn't speaking only about the folder. I was speaking about everything, the way I spent my hours, the voice I carried into rooms, the kind of woman I still was, the kind I wanted to remain. For the first time in months, I slept without turning restlessly. My dreams were simple. I was walking through a market, a red scarf around my shoulders, music drifting from somewhere unseen. I was alone, but I was not lonely. In the morning, I brewed tea and held the warm cup in my hands. The steam curled upward, delicate and insistent, and I thought, this is enough. I am enough. But the world has a way of testing resolve. A week later, my daughter called. She spoke gently, as though handling something fragile. "He's upset," she said, meaning my son. "He says you're pushing him away." I laughed softly, though it was not with humor. I am not pushing him away. I am standing where I have always stood. He is the one who has walked further back. She was quiet, and then she said, "Maybe he'll come around." "Maybe," I said. But in my heart, I knew it might take time. Perhaps more time than I had left. Still, I would not undo my choice. That evening, I turned the lights off and sat in the dark, listening to the record spin. The crackle of the vinyl filled the air, and I thought about how fragile sound is, how it disappears the moment it is born, and yet leaves a trace in the memory. Perhaps love is the same. Perhaps it changes shape, stretches thin, sometimes hurts, but never disappears entirely. I miss him. I always will. But I will not vanish myself to earn his nearness. The next morning, I cleared the dining table completely. I pushed aside the folder, the clutter of mail, the remnants of old habits. In their place, I spread out a puzzle I had bought at the market. 1,000 tiny pieces, colors scattered and chaotic. As I fit them together, one by one, I thought of my life the same way, not something handed over for others to arrange, but something I was piecing back together myself. It would take time, and patience, and mistakes. But it would be mine. When I stepped outside that afternoon, scarf around my shoulders, I felt the air sharp against my skin. Children played at the end of the street, their laughter rising like birdsong. The world went on, vast and indifferent, but I walked through it as myself, not erased, not reduced to a signature. I thought of all the years I had given quietly, all the papers I had signed without question, all the ways I had folded myself smaller to make room for others. And I thought of this moment, standing firm, steady, still learning, still present. And I knew, this was my life. However much of it remained, it was still mine to live. When I returned home, I lit a small candle on the table beside the puzzle. Its flame flickered gently, casting shadows on the walls. I sat beside it, breathing in the scent of herbs from the kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the record player. And I whispered again, not for anyone else to hear, but for myself, this is enough. I am enough.